Okay, in this second part, I want us to focus on this concept of nutritionism that you may have heard of in the popular media or in your food studies research. And nutritionism is a term that was coined by the sociologist, the Australian food studies scholar and sociologist, Georgie Scrinis, and it refers to raising concern about nutrition and diet and health to the level of an ideology. And I will give a brief history of nutrition science and then talk about his concept of nutritionism. Now, Scrinis is particularly concerned about the way that nutrition science has transformed how we think about what is good or bad to eat. And when he talks about, for example, in the article that I'm recommending you read, Nutritionism, he talks about different ways in which this ideology creates, first of all, different types of equivalences that are reductions in what food is for, but also he worries about how it disguises other ways of thinking about food. And again, when people are giving you diet advice or when people are talking about diet science, you should always be aware of the hidden assumptions or the what they think might personally be a better or worse food. And that's why I have on this slide another article where he first talked about nutritionism called Sorry Marge, where he talks about the history of how margarine came to be sold as a healthier substitute to butter. And for Scrinis, it is clear that for him, good equals natural. And he is worried about the ways that the food industry has created processed artificial foods like margarine, and then argued that these can be made to be nutritional instead of the traditional kinds of foods we had like butter, which he would argue are healthier. And for him, this is the danger that nutrition science has presented. So how does nutrition see food? Nutrition science is a pretty new way to think about diet. As you can see from this slide, the first interest in trying to study and measure food dates back to only just the 19th century, or no earlier than the 18th century, and can be understood as a part of the chemical revolution, trying to apply new empirical methods for studying the body and physiology to diet and food. So in the 19th century, the most famous early nutrition scientist was von Liebig, who is considered the father of modern study of nutrition. He studied the molecular composition of what were considered to be necessary animal substances in the diet. Eventually, studies like his led to a breaking of food into three general categories of food substances, what today we know as carbohydrates, protein, and fats, the food trinity. And Liebig was concerned about what it is in food that we need as a fundamental element of sustaining us. And so one of the things he did was to take foods. He was concerned about practical applications of nutrition science, and he took foods and reduced them to try to find out what could be the minimum supplement or extract that a person could take. And in fact, Liebig invented one of the first meat extracts, which we have now today available. And he tried to market this as well. And in a way, it perfectly illustrates what Scrinis would call as nutritionism. The idea that you can reduce a meat, which is a traditional type of food source, to just its life-sustaining core. So this feature of this mode of research was focusing on the body's vital elements and the parts of those that come from our food sources. In addition to protein, fats, and carbohydrates, in the late 19th century, people became interested in certain kinds of diseases that seemed to be associated with an absence in the diet. What would, by the early 20th century, be called vitamins. And so what was different from carbohydrates, proteins, and fats is that vitamins seemed to be something that if you added them back to the diet, suddenly diseases would disappear. And there was great interest in the early 20th century in how vitamins could be synthesized and added back to foods. All of this focus in nutrition research is on quality. And one of the ways people talk about diet science is by focusing on whether the quality of food source is better or worse. A different way to think about food is quantity. How much energy or food does one need to sustain different types of lifestyles. And so Wilbert Atwater is another American nutritionist or nutrition scientist who in the late 19th century and early 20th century attempted to try to establish what level of food as a source of energy was needed to sustain the body. His model here was of the body as a kind of motor, and his experimental approach was pretty intuitive. He tried to create a closed environment where inside a person would excrete sweat, would inhale air, excrete other kinds of gases from the body that they were then creating when they were digesting food. He would measure all the food that goes into this box and all of these changes in the air and changes in water and liquid that go out of the person, and then the net effect of this would help him determine how much food the body would need for life. And he came up with this concept of the calorie, or what's really the kilocalorie. Now, in chemistry, a kilocalorie is the amount of energy needed to raise a liter of water 1 degree at sea level, 1 degree centigrade at sea level. But what does this mean in food? I ask my students all the time, does food have a calorie? And of course, in one sense, food can be burned or metabolized, and that creates and releases energy in the form of calories. But in another sense, calorie is not a substance in food, and so it's an interesting way to think about food. Now, coming out of these two approaches in nutrition science was a way of understanding both food as energy and also as the building blocks of the body. A dramatic change happened in the 20th century that led to a change in nutrition science, and this is what is called the epidemiological transition. In this slide here, you can see on the left side, in 1900 in the United States, the incidences of different types of causes of death. And you can notice, for example, that pneumonia and flu and infectious diseases like tuberculosis caused the majority of deaths. On the other side of the slide, you can see the incidences of disease and death in 2000. And here, infectious diseases have disappeared dramatically, and instead you have chronic degenerative diseases, in particular cancer, cardiovascular disease, and heart disease. So just as a phenomenon of illness, you can see a dramatic transformation in the cause of death in the United States, and one component of that is diet. After World War II, physiologists and diet scientists became interested in what they saw as diseases of the affluent. Rich, wealthy people were no longer dying of vitamin deficiency diseases, but instead were starting to die of heart attacks and things that they quickly came to see as associated with changes in diet, in particular fattier foods, overeating, and overabundance of calories. So here you can see in this slide, Ansel Keys was one of the diet scientists famous for the diet heart thesis that is critiqued by Gary Taubes. And Ansel Keys is pointing to a change in the rates of disease and arguing that his tests show it correlates to, among other things, a more sedentary lifestyle and a change in the nutritional intake. Another level at which you can see these changes is the kinds of foods people are eating and the amounts of foods. There was an excellent photojournalism project several years ago. The book was published as called Hungry Planet. And in it, the journalist took photos of families with the amount of food they ate in a week from all around the world. Here you can see a picture of a family in Mali and then a picture in the United States. What is the difference? What can you notice as a difference? Pause the video again, write a comment down. Just describe these two photos and what you see as differences in them. And then make a note of this, include it in the comment section. Okay, because if you look at this, my students will often point out, well, on the right side in the American family, you can see lots and lots of food, much more food than you see in the family in Mali. The American family is smaller, and yet just in terms of quantity, there's more. America's food is packaged, processed. The food in Mali is in general whole grain, whole food, presumably natural. or at least not packaged and processed in this sense. More grains, less meats in the Molly diet. And one of the comments I often have students make that I think is an interesting one, they'll often say that the American diet has more variety. And I'll call them on this because what do they mean by variety? One of the tricks that critics like Scrinis point out between industrial packaged foods and whole natural foods is that if you look at this photo of the American diet, what looks like many different types of food are in fact just reprocessed basic industrial ingredients. That many of the packages look different but in fact contain the same thing. This was the core of Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore Dilemma, when he made this comment that everything, all the packaged food is made from corn. Even though it looks different, in fact, it's all the same. And so we can ask the question, is the modern American diet more varied than the modern Molly diet, or is it in fact less varied but appears so because of packaging? So the question with this epidemiological transition, with these differences between the modern American diet and Molly diet, is what has caused this change? And is the cause of this change also the cause of changes in dietary health and incidences of death? In a broad sense, the answer is obviously yes. But this question of what caused it has become a big dispute in food politics. So you can see in this slide, there has been, with the Foodler advertisement, there's been a dramatic change in how people acquire their food. We've gone from gathering to farming, shopping at local markets to shopping supermarkets, and more recently, ordering food online. Has this change in how we acquire our food changed the kinds of nutritional balances or imbalances in what we eat? And similarly, a change in our bodies, in what our body is considering good or bad to eat and willing to tolerate. For Scrinis, his answer is that the reason we have these new illnesses and problems is because industry and advertising has led us to not be able to make sensible decisions about our diet. And he argues that nutrition science and this ideology, nutritionism, is partly to blame. By focusing on a reduction in food to its elements and ignoring the broader cultural contexts of how we make decisions about food, he argues it's easier then for food manufacturers to say that value added equals healthier. Adding in vitamins, subtracting out the negative elements can somehow create a better food. In this article on nutritionism, Scrinis describes different levels of this reduction and how they deceive us. He talks about health reductionism, which is where you just look at food as only an element of health. We'll talk about that more in a moment. He has a second level of reductionism that he says is food level reductionism, where you'll talk about foods out of the context of diet. So we'll have these things called superfoods. The danger here is if you look at strawberries as a superfood of vitamin C, you're ignoring that strawberries in a diet with too much don't add anything. And with superfoods, it's easy to market them as always value added, always a plus. Then he focuses on nutritional reductionism, which is to look at nutrients instead of foods. And this creates in his mind several problems. It means that suddenly a pill with a nutrient supplement is considered equal to a food as a source of nutrients, and he says this is in fact false. It reduces nutrients to their effects or how they correlate to biomarkers. So for example, saturated fats in your diet, how it correlates is to the biomarker of cholesterol. And these kinds of reductionisms, instead of looking at diet and health, start to be focused on biochemical ideas of both. And then second order nutritionism is this idea of focusing on one nutrient at a time. And this in particular, he argues, is a marketing strategy. Instead of thinking about how when you eat a food, you're taking in many different kinds of nutrients, it starts getting to just vitamin C equals oranges, just these kinds of single nutrient, instead of looking at it all together. And more broadly, his concern is the way that all of this has made food into kind of medical practice, what some people might call the medicalization of food. And this then has created this new environment where functional foods, we're worrying about engineering foods to have health properties as possible. If part of his concern is that nutritionism reduces food to just health, what are other ways that we can describe food? And what are other things that motivate us to think about food? And I want to ask you to think about two questions here. So in a moment, I want you to pause the video and try to write down what you think would be an answer to both of these questions. First, what are other ways we could think about food in terms of health? What are other languages we use to make healthy decisions that aren't just nutrition science? And second, I want you to try to think about what are other dimensions of food that motivate us in our diet, motivate us to make changes. Not everything that motivates us in food is about being healthy. We have other reasons for thinking about food. So pause it, write down your answers to these two questions, and then continue. Okay, so one way that students sometimes have answered this question about what is healthy is they might think about organic or natural. When people try to buy organic foods, one of the motivations in doing that is they believe that foods that aren't processed, that aren't chemical in nature, are better or healthier for them. And this is Scrinis' argument about how there are other ways of talking about healthy beyond just nutrition science. And for getting to this question about other motivations for food and diet, there are many dimensions to food choices, and nutrition compartmentalizes them. It says that this food I'm buying for health and nutrition, and it ignores how you might buy food because of traditional or family practices. Similarly, price might motivate you. Some foods you might buy because they're cheap and you just need some cheap, convenient source of energy. Other foods you might buy because you think this is a healthier one. Your location and place can be incredibly important for your food choices. Buying a particular food in Korea would have one kind of meaning or one level of convenience. Buying that same food in the United States would be very different. It might be an ethnic or culturally unique food. And taste. We're very concerned about whether something tastes good or tastes bad, and it may be sometimes more important to us than health. And of course, taste in the other sense as well, which is what you eat as a representation of who you are. This idea that we're conspicuous consumers and sometimes we're motivated to eat things because we associate it with a positive lifestyle or positive image.